My name is Erik Nitschke. I'm on the product marketing team here at Corporate Visions. I know you had a lot of choices and breakout sessions, so please, thank you for choosing this one today. These are the jokes, people. Feel free to take part with the laughing. Wow. We heard a lot from Tim and from our speakers today about the three value conversations and helping your salespeople be triple threats. Content is the fun part of that because everything was all about driving skills and making sure they learn their competencies. And those are all critical things for your salespeople to learn. But it's also really important for you to be able to reinforce those skills and to turn those competencies and those stories maybe even to external stories. So we'll talk about that. But before we get into all that, I want to introduce you to a couple of people. Any of these names sound familiar to you? Arthur Freed was a huge musical movie producer in the 40s. He was responsible for some of the most successful and biggest musicals that MGM Studios had produced across the 30s and 40s. He was also a very prolific songwriter. And he had written, with a writing partner, had written hundreds of songs across the 20s and 30s that showed up in lots of different musicals. Brigadoon, Annie Get Your Gun. He was involved in Wizard of Oz. And of course, he was involved in Singing in the Rain. When MGM Studios was ready for their next big movie, they went to Arthur and said, "We want you to pull together a bunch of your songs that you didn't write for Singing in the Rain and find an umbrella story that tells a great love, romance, industry story, and connecting all those songs together." So they brought in Betty Comden and one of her writing partners to create that story. And together they used the songs and the themes throughout the songs to start with the story, created the setting and the set for the story arc and the actor and actresses that fall in love. And they also wrote all the scripts. And then finally, Stanley Donen, who you've probably never heard of, was a director on Singing in the Rain. But more importantly, he was Gene Kelly's co-choreographer. So a lot of the things that we see Gene did, Stanley actually wrote and developed and worked on those steps. So as moviegoers, as consumers, we see Gene Kelly, we see his skills. We agree that he's a great performer, and we believe that he is the triple threat who can sing and act and dance. But I'm really here to celebrate the people who contributed to that. The songwriters who developed the songs that he could sing. The scriptwriters who developed the scripts that he could act out. And then, of course, the choreographer who could make sure that he would show how well he could dance. Gene's still an important and great triple threat in his own right, but it's those people, and I'll argue it's you people, who really have a very critical supporting role in creating a triple threat. So I want to stop there and ask folks in the room, who's responsible primarily or have in your job title developing content for your sellers? Sales enablement, playbooks, guides, industry guides. Okay, I'm going to go with about a half. How about marketing content? Content that only your customers are seeing, or at least your salespeople will use. So a little bit less, but sounds like a lot of people who are developing a lot of different content. That's good to know. By the way, that's the actual piece of sheet music from Singing in the Rain with Gene Kelly's handwritten notes with the dance steps. So he was constantly taking notes, constantly improving himself, using the tools that he had to improve his performance. Sound familiar? So to kind of get started, Tim this morning had worked on, talked about a little bit this idea of improving your salespeople competencies across the entire sales cycle. Of course, showing them how to drive great pipeline, talking about developing proposals that pass executive muster and showed business value. And then finally, being able to create profitable agreements, be able to keep value throughout the entire sales process. You know we're a very big insights and numbers company. And the one that always sticks out to me is surveys that said the difference between a low-performing salesperson and a high-performing salesperson And there's lots of reasons, and you can point to all sorts of things. The number one reason, 71% of managers say it's their ability to articulate value. It's not product, it's not process, it's not being able to hit all the check marks in the CRM system. It's being able to articulate value. And that's what the 3 value conversations are all about. So when we talked about the competency model and being able to show value across this, that's what we're talking about, the 3 value conversations. So that's the model we're going to base these sessions on today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to borrow a little bit from each of our skills courses, power messaging, executive conversations, negotiation courses, SSN. And I'm going to show you some places. They're very skills focused. They are focused on helping your salespeople tell that story. But there's also a lot of great content areas for you to be able to think about how can you give the great background. If you were in the prior session, Thierry from Wipro talked about his salespeople wanted to know how you can help me prepare. That's what we can do by reinforcing the skills learned in the value conversations. So the first is a create value conversation. And that's where you're trying to get your customer to break down that status quo, where you really want to be able to differentiate yourself based on a key set of capabilities that help the customer break their status quo. I want to talk about the status quo a little bit, and we'll go back to Singing in the Rain. The primary storyline of Singing in the Rain was that across the 20s and 30s, talkies were coming into prime. Everybody was shifting. The theaters were investing heavily from moving from just regular moving pictures and maybe some music behind it to actually integrating and choreographing the music and the words to go with the movie. Big, big, huge changes. But many movie theaters and even studios were very slow to make that investment. They just didn't want to, didn't think it was important. We've been doing it this way for years. Everything's just fine. Nothing's broken. We're going to be okay. Sound familiar? I'm sure a lot of your customers are feeling the same way. 20-year-old processes, old equipment, building and managing the same exact way. But the industry's changing. The market's changing. Lots of things changing. You can't just hold on and stay with the status quo. You hear a lot about status quo for us, and stop me if you've heard this one. We use these POVs. I'm going to show you some POVs again from some of our skills courses, but I'm going to try to retell them in a way that makes sense for us. We know that when we start engaging with a customer, we believe that they're ready to buy, right? We believe that we're going to start them down the process. They're actively looking for ideas and solutions, and they're going to end up down at the end. And they're either going to choose you or going to choose your competitor. And of course, 60% often end in the status quo. They make no change because we weren't able to show the value of changing. Surveys say that 74% of executives prefer to buy from a company who provides the buying vision. So we discuss developing a why change story, something to get your customer off their status quo and show them that what they're doing today is unsafe, that you have to invest in speakers in your theater or you're going to be left behind. You have to invest in microphones on the film set or you're going to be out of business soon. Those are the kinds of conversations that we want to have. Now again, from a sales perspective, a seller skills, that's a great story to be able to tell. But what about you as content developers? So I reached into our power messaging and our power positioning courses, and I want to try and find some things that would translate pretty well that you could use today, and that's how would you go about building that why change story? And the very first thing is industry trends. The movie industry is changing. You have to get on, or here's the topics that maybe you're not aware of. Here are some insights. Here are some ideas and things that are happening in the industry that while you've had your head down, they've been happening without you. So we try to find those data points and put them, start with the data point there. When you find those data points, you got to start pointing. Here's the time for to have an uncomfortable conversation. You need to show your customer why that approach that they were using is flawed. Because what they've done is they've used old or flawed thinking that has led them down the wrong path. Now, they're not wrong necessarily, or they weren't 20 years ago. But for today's market, because you've set it up in the trend section, you're able to then now say, this is the flawed thinking that you had. And by the way, this is what's going to happen if you don't change. You're going to be out of business. You're going to have downtime. You're going to have high attrition rates in your employees. These data points are outside maybe their key focus, but they're real. But what if you had some new thinking? What if you were able to disrupt the way they were going about their business and thinking about content, or thinking about their business, and developing show them the new thinking and how that would lead them to a better way? How that your way of thinking is going to help them not only subvert those changes, because we learned today about being 3 times more likely to make a change based on risk than on gain. Show them why they are at great risk and how this is going to help them subvert that. And then show them what the likely outcome is. What will they get from that? You're going to stay in business. You're going to have lines of people lining up for your next talkie movie. We have to show that likely outcome. It's all about disrupting the story. It's all about disrupting their status quo and what they're doing today. Over the course of the session, I'm sorry, I saw some cameras go up, so I'll leave that up there. Over the course of the session, I'm going to introduce you to a company that my co-presenter, Jeff Fogum from Solenis. He's the Chief Marketing Officer of a really interesting water treatment company. And Jeff was going to come in and present and show us how his content could be created following these methods. Jeff had the nerve to schedule his customer conference at the same time as ours. So he chose his customers over you. However, he did allow us to go ahead and show and talk about some of the concepts that we're talking about. So this is just a one-page quick cut sheet that we put together. This is actually based on their power positioning event. But we went through exactly what the world is changing. Solenis takes a unique approach to water treatment. Their cooling water solution is actually all about the kind of water that cools big, huge systems. You think of factories and power plants and even IT centers, massive cloud computing centers. Most of those equipment generate tons of heat. And a lot of them are cooled by water. But there's a lot of treatment issue that has to go through to make sure that water is continuously available, that it's not virus prone, but it's not part of the core business. Core business is power generation. Core business is manufacturing or IT. Nobody really thinks about the water that's doing that business. So what Jeff's team, and through the power positioning event that we did, we tried to look at what are the numbers, what are the data points that would disrupt some of the thinking that the customers went through. So I know this is hard to read, and wouldn't be as valuable just to read it all to you, but those are the trends that are happening. Water scarcity is a huge issue today. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when you built your power plant, there was plenty of water. We didn't worry about it. There's a lot of changes in bacteria. The science of water treatment has changed, but most of his customers really weren't updating that way. So we went through and kind of mapped those topics, and again, we did it through the 2-day power positioning event. But these are the things that we pulled out that I think are accessible. If you think through the process, if you think through the flawed approach of your customers, you should be able to access this similar data. I'm going to stop there, and any thoughts on that? Any questions on, without getting into too deep on Jeff's data?
In a room together, come up with those insights.
Sure. So I'll answer from a corporate visions perspective, and we're always real careful not to be selling on that. I'm sorry? You bet. So how do you do that? How do you get people in the room, and how do you actually create those sorts of disruptive messages? From our perspective, we do it through a 2-day power positioning event. Again, I want to not talk about necessarily products today, because that's not where you're here to learn something you can use tomorrow. But in power positioning, the process we follow is get the smartest people in the room, a nice cross-functional team of sales and marketing, technical, customer service, customer-facing people who know very well what the new trends are, the things that customers should be thinking about, the flawed approach. What are they doing wrong today? You definitely have those salespeople, those product managers in your organizations. I talk to them all the time. They know what's happening, but because we're always thinking about the next product, the next sale, the next launch, we maybe aren't really listening to them the way we could. So getting them in a room and giving them a voice to create that disruptive message is huge. The flawed thinking, the consequence of change, Typically, product managers, salespeople, they've been in the industry 20-some years. They've been there a long time. They're aware of these things, and they're really able to talk intelligently about it. So we do it through a 2-day process, but they're there. And it's, getting access, getting the interview time, certainly not easy. Talk about a disruptive message. Talk about a differentiator. Instead of you coming up and saying, we've got these 17 capabilities, and 17 of them are pretty good because look at our competitive checklist that has check marks versus X's, and we're much faster in these areas. Imagine you come out and lead with that. In fact, that's what Solenis is doing with their cooling water initiative. We've got other clients who've done that. They literally put the output, the power positions, on their website. That's all they talk about. Do they talk about features, functionality? Sure, but later. Let's do that later when we are trying to get further down the road. Your product still matters. Nobody ever said product doesn't matter. But leading with the stories that we think customers care about, or at least should care about because the world is changing. I think I would recommend definitely starting with there. I think you first. Yep. That's true. So during power positioning, we look at something called the targeted conversation profile. This person, we taught how to talk to the person at the very top of the organization, or somewhere in the organization, who has the ability to make the most change. Typically, that means that it's a little more cross-industry, a little more cross-segment. You're right. There are a lot of times where you can do a lot of things for a lot of different customers, but it's still only the same product. It gets a little harder to say on a product, on a website with 20,000 pages to have one story. So we got to have some flexibility. I saw somebody over here, and now come over here.
I'm assuming this is not like one piece of content. Like you're not putting this whole story in one consumable piece.
No, I'm trying to pick out some things that I can show. What's that? Oh, so the question was, we assume this isn't just one single piece of content that we say, great, we got the story right. Here you go, everybody. Did I summarize that? No. This is more of a foundational piece. This helps tell the story. I was trying to get to a point where, of all the things we learn and we teach in power messaging and power positioning, what can you do today? If you can get this story, if we can really make this story sing, this is the foundation for lots of different content. And I have some content deliverables at the end we'll talk about. But this would be the baseline for great ebooks that don't talk about you at all. That's just about the world is changing and leading down that path to a possible solution. Want to learn more? Call me. Those are compelling blogs, social, account-based marketing, all great stuff if we get the story right. Now, in power positioning, this is actually done in more of a longer conversation roadmap document. So again, there's a little bit of variation. I'm trying to get it all crystallized. I think I had you. So I think the answer to that is the same one down here. This is competition. This takes the competition out. It really should move the competitor, because the way you develop that story, or you're following a path that a competitor can't possibly answer, that it's founded in that. So you're getting rid of the feature benefit competition at the beginning rather than. Absolutely. This is great, thank you. We're going to talk a little bit more about assets coming up near the end if we still be able to fit that in. But let me move on to the next value conversation, and that is elevate value, and the way Tim described it, about being able to have escalate your conversations and show business value to an executive. And I'll go back to Singing in the Rain for a second. If you've seen Singing in the Rain, you remember there's this great 10-minute long scene called Broadway Ballet. Gene Kelly and a coworker are in a studio with the executive, the guy who owns the money, the guy who owns the creative process. And Gene is pitching this huge idea, the way to end the movie they're working on together. And he's describing it in great detail. In fact, for us, it ends up turning into a 10-minute song and dance with clowns and lots of things happening. The famous scene with Sid Charisse, where she's smoking a cigarette and she puts her leg up in the air to stop Gene. Famous scene. It all happens as sort of, not a dream, but at least a description of something that Gene wanted to do. At the end of the scene, we come back. We're back in the small studio with Gene and the executive. And Gene says, so what do you think? Executive says, I can't quite visualize it. How many executives do you know like that? How many are in your organization? You have to learn to talk to an executive. Conrad, I won't even go over what Conrad Smith highlighted this morning. Executives think different, they have different responsibilities, and you need to be able to tell the story in a way that resonates to them. Not just because Gene Kelly, you're a great dancer and whatever you want to do works, but how's this going to save my business? How's this going to really contribute to a better movie, which is going to put butts in seats, is going to help me reinvest in talkies and succeed long term, not just a great creative venture. So we're trying to think about ways that we as writers, as content developers, can contribute to that conversation that we're teaching in executive conversations. And I want to pull back to one of the POVs we talk about, and again, refresher to some, new to others. In surveys they do with executives, executives value conversations about business expertise 4 times more than about product knowledge. They want to talk about business value. Conversely, when they're asked about the salespeople who come and call on them, they say that they are 88% proficient in talking about their products, but only 24% proficient in actually having a business conversation. So what that means is executives are 4 times more likely, or 4 times less likely to get a conversation they value 4 times more. And that's, in executive conversations, we call that the business value gap, and we show opportunities and skills you can learn to be able to counteract that. But as content developers, what can we do to fill in that business gap, to make salespeople a little bit more able to have that conversation so they're not afraid of talking to executives? So again, I borrowed a little content from there, from executive conversations, and walking through how to learn to talk to an executive, and particularly how to talk to a specific executive. Because a lot of what if we're talking to salespeople, we want them to be able to prepare for a specific sales call, or a specific company, or a specific executive. So we show them how to do external research, how to find the huge market factors, the external factors that are influencing your customer today, particularly that executive. We go through and find what are the business initiatives that your customers, that one customer is probably going through to be able to impact and address those external factors. And in a lot of cases, this content is in 10Ks, and we talk about where to find this information. Finally, if we could kind of create a vision in the executive's brain on how to go from where you are today and where maybe you could be tomorrow, that would be a very valuable conversation, because now you're starting to show value to the executive. And then finally, can you prove it? Can you show me numbers? Can you show me examples? Can you give me the metrics that back all this up? Now that is part of, one, creating that buying vision, and then proving your point. Now this is a conversation that sellers learn to have, and we teach them some basics on how to get that information for a single customer. But what if you, as content developers, were able to actually provide some of that information up front? So Solenis had gone through executive conversations, and we went back through some of the information we had from them through interviews and their conversation roadmap, and we highlighted some of those external factors, and we talked about them up front. You can see there's some bleed between the create value conversation and all the value conversations, because we really wanted, the biggest point is here is, of course, breaking the status quo. So what are the external factors? We've given a few that the salespeople can highlight. Business initiatives, current situation, all these data points, all these factors and strategies, they're all part of their selling tools, but they hadn't thought about them in this way. So we try to at least show the salespeople to have the conversation. And I think this is something that we could probably mirror as content developers as you get close to your customers. Again, for individual customers, would still work for account-based marketing, for specific social selling kinds of topics, where you're very focused on a sector and industry, a discrete set of customers. So, yep. No, well, so this is, whether it's a 1-page or a 5-page, or we've got a model for an executive conversation playbook, which kind of blows all this out. You're right. It really still you need to be founded in the skills to be able to do that. That is part of the executive conversations workshop that will show individual salespeople how to do that, how to do the research, how to turn that into insight, how to turn that into financial metrics. That is part of it. Some of this, you can start that conversation without executive conversations, but it is sort of a match set for some of those topics, you're right. thought I saw another hand, but that's okay. Okay, let's move on to the final value conversation, because I want to make sure we have enough time to answer any additional questions. And that's the ability to capture value, to be able to extend the deal, so to be able to really avoid any kind of discounting and capture all value across the entire sales process. I'm pointing to what's not there. So let me point to something that you've seen a couple times now, so I'll go through it real quickly. And that's the idea of identifying unconsidered needs. And as marketers, we often go through and as we're developing our messages, we start talking about customers' existing needs. What have they said they need? What do the surveys say? If Forrester and IDC are reviewing certain segments, what are customers saying they're going to be buying over the next 5 years? Let's align all of our capabilities and our stories and our data sheets to that. The challenge with that, of course, is your competitors are doing the same thing. Everybody's all aligned to the same stories, and now we're back to that competitive chart that has all the pluses and half moons saying we're faster at this and faster at that. Again, if we go back to the buying vision story about most people want to buy from somebody with the buying vision, let's talk about unconsidered needs. What is happening in your customer's organization that they're not aware of? What's happening in their marketplace that they haven't prepared for? And those things that, the same with the status quo story, how are we going to be able to address those with strengths that we haven't talked about yet? Rather than talk about the same capabilities everybody else is, maybe we talk about the capabilities that address those unconsidered needs. And now you've got a basis for true differentiation. Now you've got something that's really unique to you and shows some kind of urgency for the customer. Now, this is part of actually of our situational sales negotiation course, and we use it interchangeably in our messages, in our power messaging courses as well. But this is the kind of thing that you can use as content. I'm going to go through real fast because this ends up part of your the content I'm going to recommend. If I tell you that you're going to go out of business in 6 months because you haven't done something, is that urgent? I mean, I'm giving an obvious example, but that's the urgency. If I'm going through a buying process as a customer and I've identified these 12 things in my RFP, and these are the things I want you to answer because these are the things I know, there's some value, I think, and obviously we've invited a lot of people to the desert to talk about it. There's some value in being able to talk about unconsidered needs, to be able to say, you've thought about this and you're happy here, but what you don't realize is this is even more important. That the exposure of staying on your status quo is greater than the risk and the fear and maybe the potential cost of moving to this new place. So it's not an easy answer. My answer to you is, if you do it right, it's plenty urgent. Yesterday, Zach talked a little bit about using unconsidered needs first. And again, I won't go through the entire process, but the power of using the unconsidered needs first is measurable. And when it comes to insight selling, presenting content insights first and then asking diagnostic questions is measurable. Whether how you're using insight selling and insight solution approach, these are the things that brain science and real research tell us. So how, as content developers, can we impact those? Well, in Solenis' case, for their cooling water initiative, we went through and found some very specific capabilities that only they have. Now, let's face it, we all have value-added services and things that we talk about throwing into the deal, but what can we do about mapping them to specific unconsidered needs? So, real-time performance. People aren't measuring the way their water flows through those big machines and through their data centers. But what if you could? And here's the impact of doing it, and here's some insights into why that's so important in your provocative question. So what we've tried to do is follow here at least the power of the unconsidered need, the research that Zach gave us about insights, and then how and when to ask provocative questions. I'll stop there on that. Thank you for that one question. Are there other questions about that? So I want to make sure that that didn't get pushed under. It is hard to make sure that it is not only unique, but important for today. So I won't say that I have a silver bullet to RFPs because I don't think anybody has gotten there. Probably the power of that is that first stage of the RFP where they say, do you have any questions? Get them back to us by next week. If you take the chance there to ask real provocative questions and even get some insights, because I've seen some clients and actually been with companies who have done that. You say, well, thank you. Question 3 asks for A, B, and C. We can do that, but let me ask you a question about it. Readdress it even within terms of the RFP. They can't change the RFP once it's been issued, but it gives you a little more leeway later when they say, well, that was really interesting. I can't give the RFP, but let's talk about something else. Again, it's not a sure win, but front load it and change the story. Reframe the entire situation so that they're considering things that maybe they should have. And I'm sure we've all seen RFPs that have gotten canceled because they realized they weren't asking for the right things. So in the time that's left, let's pull all this together. So we've talked about the 3 value conversations. We talked about how they reinforce the skills that sellers learn at each of the steps. I think whether you use examples like these or otherwise, there's a cadence of content you can develop that starts at the very beginning from the initial touch in developing that pipeline, through the conversation to have the executive and get executive buy-in, through the negotiation and the final pricing opportunity. You can follow some of the blanks. I pointed to a few places where maybe these blended at some point, where we talked about status quo here when we started the conversation there. In power messaging, we talk a lot about the target and their world. Well, we carried that a little bit in executive conversation. So really, content can be that bridge between all the value conversations. From going from how the customer's world is changing, what things they need to be aware of, aligning with executives to make sure that they have, we can get some kind of financial backing, and then challenging their certainty and driving profitable opportunities. This is one of Leslie's favorite sides because it's Leslie's team that actually, at least for us, creates these things. We talked about content across the 3 value conversations, and I focus mostly on the training enablement piece, how to build playbooks, guides like the one I showed you. We talked about how maybe some could be expanded, larger playbooks inside of others, but really this content can go in lots of different places. Direct sales content, things to teach and train and enable your salespeople on different pieces of the industry, different segment marketing opportunities. Those are all things you can learn through the research that we talked about in both executive conversations and the negotiation practice. And finally, I think only about 1/3 of the room was actually responsible for marketing, but those stories can go on your website, can go in the demand gen campaigns. They can be within your social selling and your account-based marketing. If we're really talking about disrupting the way a customer thinks and acts, if we really want to make sure we're driving that value conversation, the stories, the content you developed that follow the 3 value conversations should find its way into all these assets. And Solenis did that. I would have asked Jeff to kind of talk about his assets here. These were content assets, ebooks, playbooks, infographic, that were developed out of their Power Businessing event. So they actually, part of their Cooling Water initiative was they launched a campaign and sales training at the same time. So the content assets, the demand gen, all their social media, all started the conversation. Let's face it, marketing is the first part of the conversation, right? They started the conversation using the story, using the insights that we developed, and then carried out through the entire sales process. I'll stop there with that one, and happy to tell you more about those. So bring it all together. How could you do that? So if this is how Solenis did it, I'm going to give you some tools to do it yourself. And if you're actually taking those pictures, write down that URL, because that URL will bring you to those 3 templates. They're just one-pages. They're just examples that we showed from Solenis, but these are the kinds of things that we think start your ability to think through the process, to think through the messages, and then develop the content across the 3 value conversations. Oh, thank you. Jamie reminds us that is case sensitive, so capital C, V, and C. And that doesn't work, try lowercase. See, you can't be too certain all the time. If I say I'm 100% certain, then you may not believe me, so. I'll leave that one up there if you're still looking. What kind of questions do you have? I think we have a few extra minutes left, so go ahead. Yeah, so I wish I had Jeff's sales numbers. Cooling Water actually exceeded their expectations. Right? Now, they did a lot more than just create some content around there, some skills development, and they did their own. They had a really good idea, so they came to us with a very specific segment, knowing what they'd want to do. We helped develop the story, but yeah, it was very successful. We've got some good crosstalk in the middle of all this, so everybody's exhausted.
So if you have a small team.
Oh, here it is. Small team. What else do you do in your spare time when you're not sitting here?
There is no way this is all happening at any given time. Where would you start?
I'd always start in the beginning. I'd start in the beginning because that differentiating story, being able to disrupt the customer status quo is probably the basis. I won't say that of all the skills I would do one over the other, but as a content developer, I spent several years in the content services team as a content strategist before moving to this role. I would always want to start here because at least now I have a differentiated story that nobody else can touch. The other, we pointed out that maybe some of these contribute a little bit better if your salespeople have gone through those sales skills. I think there's a lot of universality to that. So an asset like this, if you get it right, could still be hugely valuable. But I would start with the why change message. That's just mine. Yep, absolutely. So for all three value conversations, I think this morning you saw Tim talk about it primarily from the skills side, the teaching side, being able to learn the skills and then apply them. We do that in the room during power messaging and executive conversations and negotiation courses. That's when we have the opportunity to actually test and watch them, and they get to see it practiced and modeled by one of our skill facilitators. That's the controlled area where we can show those skills development. How can I test whether they use your content? We'd have to go back and look at CRM and results after that. So it's not as easy to answer.
Do you work with the managers? So do you do launch it to the managers first? Because at the end of the day, ideally you're upskilling coaching capabilities of the managers because they're the ones that really should be observing and modeling that behavior. Right? Because once they're out of the classroom,
Who knows? So the question was, what about managers? Are you teaching them first? We're not necessarily teaching them first. We hope that they go through the power messaging class alongside their salespeople. And then we do have a power coaching agenda that we can also follow. So I just got the high sign. We're out of time. Please, if you don't mind, take a second, do the survey. Thanks very much. Appreciate all your input.